Good evening. My name is Joe Doan. I'm a licensed professional engineer. I have engineering licenses in 4 states, 2 active, 2 inactive. My expertise ranges all over the place as far as engineering goes. But one of the realms of expertise I have is water quality, water contamination, also toxic waste on properties, and remediation processes to get that toxic waste off of the property. I was the borough engineer in Lodi, New Jersey during the 70s. Besides being the borough engineer, I was the director of public works. And the reason I mention that is because that town, their water supply was from deep wells. And the majority of the property in that town was zoned industrial. And they had all these manufacturing plants there, and it was nothing but a problem to keep the water quality where it was, where it should have been, and address all the problems that came from these manufacturing sites that were in the town. I live in Bearsville. I've been paying taxes in Woodstock for 50 years. And tonight, I basically want to talk about the engineering investigations that were done in 2012 for Miller Howard, who purchased that property from Model Optics. They had an engineering report done back at that time, and the other one would be obviously the current one, which was done for the board by Collier Engineering. Anyhow, the investigation that was done by Ecosystem Statistics, which was the engineering firm hired by Miller Howard to do the engineering or the environmental investigative report for them, showed extremely high toxic levels of arsenic and lead, which exceeded the recommended level by the DEC to remediate. So in 2012, that site was definitely a waste site, and it had arsenic and lead on it that exceeded the recommended levels of the DEC. And that's a fact. It's in the report, and you can read it in one of the reports that's published on the side over there. Or hung on the
This
side.
right here, Joe.
Right.
This right
Okay, so anyhow, it's a known fact. They tested for arsenic on that property, and it exceeded the levels by the DEC. They tested for lead on that property, and it exceeded the levels for DEC. And at this point, I want to state emphatically that stuff like that just doesn't disappear off the site. You got to remediate it. You got to dig up all the contaminated earth and the groundwater that's in there that might be contaminated. That all has to be taken up and disposed of at sites that are licensed to take hazardous waste. And believe me, nobody in this room wants to get involved with anything like that on their property. Because instead of, say, spending $100 to get rid of material like that isn't contaminated, you'd be spending $5,000 to get rid of the small amount of toxins that you might have on your property. So the cost to get rid of this stuff is astronomical once it's done. And like I said, I want to emphasize, once it's there, it doesn't just disappear like magic, and you end up getting these clean reports. Anyhow, the property was purchased, eventually purchased by Miller Howard in middle of 2012, and they immediately started going to work on it. Soon after they purchased the property, they got a building permit to put in a septic tank and a new D-box and a couple new laterals in the septic. And that was in 2013. And then also in the end of 2013, they approached their neighbor to the north, which is was the Gypsy Wolf, and they worked out a deal with them to buy 9/10 of an acre from them, but they had to go in front of the planning board to get approval for that lot line relocation, which the town considers a minor subdivision. So they had this agreement with the Gypsy Wolf. They were gonna buy 9/10 of an acre. They went to the planning board and asked approval to have that done. And one of the issues that probably wasn't discussed about too much during that period, but that you have two lots adjacent to one another. One of the lots is it's conforming to all the requirements of the zoning laws. The other lot is non-conforming. It doesn't conform to any of the zoning laws as far as setbacks or anything else like that. So Miller Howard wanted to buy 9/10 of an acre from the Gypsy Wolf. And at that time, that was when the Gypsy Wolf, I don't know if it was closed down, but it was certainly in the process of closing down their business and selling it to the diner guy from Phoenicia. Anyhow, this request that was made by the planning board, or the request that was made to the planning board, was to take a conforming lot and a non-conforming lot, transfer property from the one to the other, and create two non-conforming lots. Now, let me tell you something, an experienced planning board would have never let that happen, because the last thing they want are non-conforming lots in the town. But anyhow, this planning board was new, inexperienced, along with the zoning board, because they had just fired everybody on the zoning board, they picked out new people for the planning board. They were both inexperienced at the time, but they ended up approving that. So the 9/10 of an acre went from the Gypsy Wolf to Miller Howard, and it created a lot size for Miller Howard from a half an acre to an acre and a half. And now they had room to spread out and do things that they couldn't do with the lot that they had, with their existing lot. So immediately after getting approval from the planning board, they started getting building permits from the town to do a lot of work. One of them was the major work of adding on to the existing building that was there, putting in a new septic system. They got demolition permits to strip out the interior of the existing building that was there, and that was totally illegal, because the interior of that building was as contaminated as the stuff they were dumping in the ground and the soil that they were contaminating. Because that's where the manufacturing process started, in that building, and that's where all these toxics were developed. So I'm 100% convinced that the interior of that building was totally contaminated with really bad stuff, including arsenic. But anyhow, Miller Howard hires a contractor to come in and demolish the interior of the building. They took all the sheetrock down, the insulation, the ceilings, the floor, they took everything down, and they disposed of it. It was put into big containers, and it was disposed of off-site. And it didn't go to a licensed site where they accept toxic waste. God knows where it went. It went somewhere, but it didn't go to a toxic waste site, because there was never any mention by Miller Howard that they had a problem inside that building. They didn't tell anybody. And unfortunately, the workers who went in there, we were exposed to all of this stuff, not knowing what they were breathing when they were inside that building.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that's what was done initially. They got a demolition permit. They cleaned out the entire inside of that the old building, and they modified the septic system a little bit. They put in a new septic tank to replace the old one, and they put it back in the same spot the old one was. They also put in a new distribution box for the septic system, and they added 2 laterals off of it. Now, the original system didn't have laterals in it. It had 2 seepage pits that ran off of the septic tank that was there. And basically what was happening, all the toxic wastes that were being generated inside of that building, well, instead of paying a licensed transporter to take that toxic waste off-site and bring it to a site where they can process material like that, they said, hey, why spend all that money doing that? We could just dump it into our septic system. And that's exactly what they did. They ran it through the plumbing that went into the septic tank. Then they had a dry well, which isn't connected to the septic tank. It was an older way to get rid of effluent from your house, mostly clean stuff. Rinse water from your washing machine, shower water, taking a bath, whatever. It was the cleaner wastewater that's generated in the house, went directly from the house to the dry wells. And I guarantee you what they had there was they had a utility sink set up somewhere in that building, and that's what they did. They dumped it right into the utility sink, and it went right out to that dry well, because that dry well was also heavily contaminated with arsenic and lead when they did the testing in 2012. So now they demolished everything. They took all the plumbing out from inside, and they modified the septic a little bit. And then they got a permit to do construction on a new wing, which was attached to the old building. And when you look at the old building, you can see where the original structure was and the part that was added on. The original structure is on the south end of the property. The new work is on towards the middle of the property. So anyhow, Miller Howard does all this stuff, and they make a really nice building. It looks great there. They cleaned up the lot, put grass down, planted shrubs and trees and everything like that. It really looked nice. You know, they did a lot of work. They spent a lot of money there. Well, anyhow, the pandemic comes, and what they do is they vacate the building, they send their people home to work, and they were still doing business when they were at home, making investments, etc. And the building kind of sat empty there during that period of time. And then the beginning of 21, I guess the owners of, Miller Howard decided we could have our employees kind of sit home and do the work there. What do we need a big building like this for? And they decided to sell it. And the reason why I know that there was activity with them and them trying to sell the site is because during that period of time, there were, if you pulled up 10 Dixon Avenue on the web, what pops up is pretty much everything that's going on that site at 10 Dixon Avenue. And there were two realtors. One was Remax, which is a national company, and then there was another realtor, which I don't remember their name right now. What they did is they posted that site, and they gave all the particulars about it. And the big thing was they gave an appraised value of what that property was worth at that time in the beginning of 2021. Their appraised value was $1.5 million. The other realtor's appraised value was $1.6 million, pretty close. The only problem with the value that they posted were that the people doing the calculations and figuring out what that property was worth never knew that it was contaminated. And I emphasize that point. That property was contaminated, and it's still contaminated today because nothing was done to remediate and remove all the poisons and toxins that were dumped into that site. And they, like I said, they don't just disappear by magic. You gotta mechanically remove them and remediate. And the remediation process is done under the watch of the DEC. They do the testing. Every time you dig out a spot, they'll test the soils on each side of the excavation. And if it's still contaminated, they tell you, keep going. And you keep going until you reach a point where the soil is clean and all that poison is taken out, and then they bring in new soil, clean soil, that they fill in with, and now the site has had all the hazardous waste removed from it. And it's done under the auspices of the DEC, not Miller Howard giving direction to contractors, do this, take this out. Then also the fact that they took the septic tank out and they replaced it with another one. That septic tank was contaminated also, because that's where they were dumping all the toxin, and it went through the septic tank, and it also went into the dry well. So when they took out the septic tank, when they took out the seepage pits, when they took out the dry well, which was located further up towards the middle of the property, it was illegal. That stuff was contaminated with all that bad stuff, arsenic, lead, chlorinated compounds that they use in industries to clean equipment and everything else. It was really bad stuff, and you didn't want to be around it. You didn't want to even work in there, because just being exposed to it, it's unhealthy. So anyhow, they had this activity in the beginning of 2021 where they wanted to sell the property, and these real estate people were coming in and posted all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, it stopped, you know? And the way it was stopped was on those sites where they listed everything and they had the appraised value of the property on there. They put a little sign across there and it said off market. And what that means is the site was pulled off of the market for any number of reasons. The one could be they just decided they're not going to sell, and they stopped advertising and taking bids on the property. And the other thing could have been that they got a good offer for somebody and they were negotiating to sell, and they stopped taking offers at that point, and they were negotiating, right? Well, anyhow, you don't hear much during that period of time until our library board comes up and they offered them $2.6 million for a property that was appraised at $1.6 million, $1 million over what the market value was at the time. And to add insult to injury, on page 4 of the contract between the library and Miller Howard, they had a release where, this just blows me away, why they even put that in there. It says, there's some verbiage there, and it says the release forever, they release forever the seller's affiliates from any future environmental claims. Now, geez, who would ever put that in a contract, taking the liability from the seller and putting it on the shoulder of the taxpayers of Woodstock? And that's exactly what that paragraph is doing. So if sometime in the future, the DEC steps in and does testing in the right place and finds that the levels exceed, they're going to tell them, you've got to remediate. And to be perfectly honest, I think it would be a lot easier for them to tell 1,000 people in Woodstock who are paying for it, to tell them to do it, than to tell some individual property owner to do it, you know? So anyhow, that's in there. And you have to ask yourself, what are they talking about? Future environmental claims. Well, somehow, somebody knew that that property is contaminated with really hazardous waste material, and they put that in there. And I think it was Miller Howard who did it, you know, just to protect themselves and the people that work for them. They put that in there, and the president of the library board gives that to them. It's like a get out of jail card for those people. And so anyhow, that's the other thing. And then, of course, the last thing is not so significant. They gave Miller Howard a $33,000 down payment for signing the contract, which basically at this point, it's non-refundable. Something happens and we don't buy that property, they get to keep our. Well, anyhow, so now there's a contract between Miller Howard and the school board. And the school board has to hire an engineering firm to do the same environmental testing that was done 10 years earlier for Miller Howard when they bought the model optics property in 2012. And I just want to add that the reason why the school board had to hire this environmental group.
We are the library board, Joe, not the
What's
school
that?
board. We are the library board. Library. It's a library board, not a school board. You keep saying school
I'm sorry.
board.
Okay, whatever. You know what I mean, right, Mr. Collins? You know exactly what I mean. But anyhow, they had to hire this engineering firm to do the same engineering environmental evaluation that was done 10 years earlier. And the reason why they had to hire this engineering firm was not to find out what was wrong with that property and to tell all the people in the town what was going on or everything. They had to hire them because they needed to hire them to get a bond. That's the main reason why that happened, where they hired this engineering group. Well, anyhow, they hired the engineering group, and basically they presented their report in 3 sections. The first section was kind of a generic inspection of the history of the site. They called to question the results of the tests that were done back in 2012, where they showed that the arsenic and lead levels exceeded DEC recommendations. And it's right in their report that they gave us, okay? So now they got a site that's contaminated and nothing was ever done to fix it. So that's the first thing. So the next part of the report was called a phase 1 report, where they actually went out and they tested the property for everything, arsenic, lead, all these different minerals, etc. They've done testing. They've tested the soil and they've come up with levels of contamination. And one of the things they did was they did 10 soil tests to determine if there's any arsenic in it. 10, okay? And basically what happened was, when you average the 10 readings of those 10 samples, it comes up to 7. I'm not going to tell you what the units are, but it comes up to 7. And the remediation level established by the DEC is 16. So, no, you're not up to 16, but you're up to 7. That's pretty high, you know? And if you want to evaluate what those levels mean, if you took a glass of wine and you put 16 drops of arsenic in it, and that would be a glass that the DEC would tell you that's got to be remediated, you know? And then if you took a glass that had 7 drops in it, and would you drink either one of them? No. You wouldn't drink the one with 16 because you would die fast. And the one with 7 would probably kill you anyhow. It would just take a little longer. So anyhow, these are the results that they got. And they listed in their report that came out, and it had 359 pages in it.
Wow.
And they listed everything, you know, all the tests that they did, et cetera. The problem was, you had to go through 297 pages of nothing. There was no data on there. All there was this stuff about what the levels are of the DEC. They go through it for maybe 20 pages. Then they go through the same thing for another 20 pages. And like I said, 297 pages of that report, there was nothing on it that we could use. You had to go to page 298, and they listed, I think, 3 tests for arsenic. 299, there were maybe another 3. There were a total of 10 tests on those 4 pages. And like I said, they averaged out to be 7. Now, you know, when I kind of read that, I kind of wondered why, you know, why did those test results drop down when it was done 10 years earlier? They were way up there, and now they're down here somewhere, you know? And there's probably a couple explanations, but I didn't figure out the real explanation on why those levels dropped until I went to the site yesterday and walked around, and the flags where they took the soil samples were still in the ground. And I almost fell out of my car when I saw what was going on. You know, the first thing is, all the contamination that was dumped on that property was dumped behind the building in the septic system and the dry well. That's where it was. So the contamination was behind the building, and it's now underneath the existing parking lot that's there, all right? So the crew of Collier's Engineering, who came out and did the testing, they only did 2 cores in the pavement of the parking lot. Just 2, okay? And it turns out that one of them, in the process of them taking the coring sample, they contaminated the sample with asphalt from the core bit that they used to go through the asphalt. They weren't testing the asphalt. You had to go through the asphalt, make a hole, and then put another clean core bit in there to take the soil sample. And what they did, they must have went right down through the asphalt into the soil, and they tested that sample, and it was contaminated with asphalt. So now, out of the 2 fairly decent samples that were taken in the area where the contamination was, one of them is no good, okay? So there's a total of 40, all right? There were 40 tests done. 2 of them were in the parking lot where the contamination basically was. One of the cores they took was invalid because they couldn't use it, it was contaminated. And then there were 14 others that they took in the side yard, which is a narrow strip between the existing building and the building next door, which is right on the property line, which is about 23 feet or something like that. So 14 of those tests were done in a completely innocuous area on that site. There was no testing that was done there originally, and there was no reason to believe that there were any toxics there because nobody dumps the toxic material in the side yard. And then they took another 24 tests in the front yard right next to Dixon Avenue. Now, how is that possible? That you're there to test the site and you do 40 tests and only one of them is anywhere near where the toxics are on that property. All of them were done in the front yard and on the side yard, which is totally ludicrous if an engineer looked at that and said, and there's no explanation for it. There's no good explanation. There are other explanations, and they're dark. You know, if you want to talk about what the intent was when they did that. But the bottom line is, 97% of the tests that were done were outside that zone of contamination on the property. And only 1 test was done. And like I said, even though that area was out of the zone of contamination, it still came in at 7 when they averaged everything together, you know? So the fact that that area showed increased levels of asbestos and other contaminants means the toxic plume on that property is moving. And it's moving because the groundwater is perking through the soil and heading down to the site where our water, where we get the water for our distribution system in town. There's 7 wells down at the site, 300 feet from this property. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that this whole deal stinks, everything. The contracts, the behind the wheel, the behind the room, the closed door meetings, to come up with this contract. The engineering firm who did these reports were questionable, believe me, because the last report they issued, they said nothing about arsenic in the soil, nothing. They mentioned it once, and it was in the little historic manufacturing paragraph that they put in there about the history of the site and the manufacturers that were on it. So they never mentioned arsenic, number one. They never mentioned the fact that the town wells are 300 feet down the street, on the same street on the opposite side. Never mentioned that, which is important. You got a contaminated site, and you got wells that are pulling water out of the ground to supply it to the people in the community. And the arsenic is in the ground, it's contaminating it. And another thing that they didn't do, which I kind of called to their attention, was that they never did any arsenic in water tests. They just didn't do any. And you would think, you got arsenic, you got groundwater. Yeah, I think it's feasible to think that maybe you should take and test the groundwater and see if the arsenic is getting into it. But they didn't do that. They didn't want to do it. And another thing, as far as testing water for arsenic, the amount of arsenic that's in a water sample, according to the New York State Department of Health, the EPA, and in Ulster County too, but it starts at the EPA. They establish the standards for drinking water. And when it comes to arsenic, they only allow this little bit of arsenic in the water before it makes the water non-potable, okay? I mean, you can't even see it. It's 10 parts per billion. All the other tests that they do for contaminants in water are measured in parts per million. So this is 1,000 times greater than all the other stuff they were testing for, So it means a lot to the EPA and the state health authorities to keep that level as low as they can. And they measure it in parts per billion, all right? So believe me, if I had to take a wild guess, and if they put a sampling well on that property and started drawing samplings of the groundwater that's there, they're gonna find arsenic in it. How much, I don't know, because you gotta test to find out. And also, the site down where the wells are for the town should also be tested. And test the groundwater there, because that's what they're pulling out of the ground to put into their system. And, one little added bit of information about the well system for the water department. I didn't know anything about it, and I happened to, about a week ago, I got my hands on the report that they issued for 2021. And basically, they described, how many wells were on the site, and how much production they do every day. They provide 300,000 gallons of water to the users in the district. So they're producing 300,000 gallons of water a day to provide for the water district. 300,000 gallons a day is a lot of water, and they're only getting it out of 7 wells, okay? So if you figured the 7 wells and you divided it into 300,000, and then you divided it into hours, gallons per hour, then break it down to gallons per minute, which is the measuring unit for a well, What's your well? Well, my well, I get 7 gallons to the minute, which is okay, so that's a good well, So that's how you measure it, gallons per minute. Anyhow, if those wells were running 24 hours a day to produce that 300,000 gallons, the yield on those wells would be over 30, which is extremely good, okay? And the reason why those wells can produce that much water, okay? And I'm gonna add in the fact, the wells are only 20 foot deep. That's what the report says. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but the report says we have 7 wells and they're 20 foot deep. And anybody wants to see it, I have the report here with me. So what that means is that the wells are only drawing groundwater from around 20 feet. They're not drawing groundwater from 30 feet or 40 feet because the water goes into the end of the well, and that's 20 foot down. So they're taking water high up in the water table, and the higher you go in the water table, the poorer the quality of the water is. So when you take water from the top and compare it to water that you take 50 feet down or 100 feet down, it's going to show that the quality is certainly worse than the water that you get from deeper down. So they're taking water from the water table and they're taking the worst quality of water, which is sitting right on top of the water table, you know? So anyhow, that's another thing that's concerning because that's the area. If arsenic ever does work its way down from that site, it's gonna come in high. And that's where they're taking the water to supply the district with. Anyhow, that pretty much ends, what I have to say. And believe me, I have a concern for what's going on with the water department. I mean, so far, nothing has been said. The tests that were done, they had a sample test that they included with this report. And what they tested was for boron, they tested for copper pollution, and then they tested for a few other things, parameters. But they didn't test for arsenic in the water. So anyhow, it just raises a red flag with me and what I know about, wells and water production and everything else. And I hope that we do a little extra testing now that we know the site 300 feet up the road has and was and still is contaminated with that material because it didn't walk away by itself and nobody remediated it. Thank you for listening. That's the end of my presentation.
Now, in 2013, a new tank was put in, and it's 1,000 gallons. Now, according to the Ulster County Department of Health requirements, now I'm not even going to list library staff or volunteers that work there. I'm just going to list patrons. Patrons, it requires 5 gallons per person per day. Doesn't matter if you're in there for 5 minutes or 8 hours. That's the requirement, 5 gallons per person per day. Now, in 2017, on the library's annual reports, they showed they had 118,950 visitors. That would require 2,285 gallons per day. That tank only is going to hold 1,000. It's too small. Now, I have a whole list up there from 2018, 2019. None of them, with the totals that the library has on their website, would make it sufficient at 1,000 gallons. So Pat, you're right. The septic tank that's there now will be too small for the library.
And the drain
Now,
field.
do we know
The drain
how
field
much
as
room
well.
is in that lot? It's a very tiny area in the back. I don't know. I'm not an engineer. I don't deal with septic tanks. I have no idea, but it seems very tight to be able to add on to that.
It hasn't been examined
No, it has not.
prior to buying the building.
Correct.
Can I just interrupt you a
Yes.
second? On one of the architectural drawings, there were, the assessor made 8x11 copies of certain parts of the drawing that was available at some point. And it specifically shows a system that the septic tank is where it was originally located in its original position, which is about 15 feet off the building in the rear. And then the disposal fields are all the way in the back of the property, which was property that they acquired from the Gypsy Wolf. And it appears that somebody did a design on it. It shows the disposal area, it has 5 laterals in it, and then right above it is the reserve area, which is a requirement that when you do engineering work, you have to show on the drawing. So they showed the field, which appears to be adequate, and they showed the reserve area, and they showed the new the septic tank. But what they had to install and also in the system is a pump chamber, because there's no way the effluent from that septic tank is gonna get to that field by gravity. So they had to put a pump chamber in there so they could pump the effluent from the septic tank up into the disposal field, which was way in the back of the property there. So basically, it seems to be a halfway decent design. I mean, I didn't go through the numbers, but the issue that I see with that system is that it only has a 1,000-gallon tank in it, you know? And it should be it should be at least 1,250. What do you say, Joe Bowick, sitting back there?
It needs to be even
engineering?
bigger than that.
Huh?
It needs to be even larger than that if the library claims the number of visitors that they have per year.
Right,
In 2017, they would have needed 2,285 gallons.
well,
For Ulster
you're not gonna
County.
get that, I'll tell you.
Right.
I think what they found was something, but it's not the something that is evidently at the level of needs for remediation according to DEC, but it still will kill you. And I think that matters. I don't want my grandkids rolling around in that grass.
Well, you know, that's the report, the current report by Collier. The report by Ecosystem Statistics specifically said you got elevated concentrations of arsenic and lead, and they exceed the limits of the DEC. That needs remediation. That's it. That's in the report. I mean, there's no, I mean, you can't change the wording of this report. This is what it says.
That
And
was
this is
sent to Jeff
documentation,
Collins.
and it's facts.
So I
And
think
nobody from the other side of the pro-library people want to accept anything as fact. They talk about stories and lies and exaggerations and everything else by us. And all I'm doing is reading what I pulled from all of these reports.
I cannot see any logic in why the library offered $1 million more than not the listed price, but the price that was given by REM when they were evaluating the value of that property. Why are you paying an extra $1 million? We don't know. And the taxpayers are the ones who are gonna pay it. That's really scuzzy, and I'm telling you the truth. It's not appropriate, it's not normal, and any real estate negotiation, 99% of the time, 10% is taken off, not $1 million added, which is like 1.5 times the value of the place. It's crazy. There's no reason for it. I don't wanna pay that. I don't know why any taxpayer would wanna pay $1 million extra for that property. It makes no sense at all. The other thing is, how in the world have you gotten a zoning situation like the one you're in and you're ignoring it? There's illegal zoning for libraries in the light industrial zone. How on earth can you get a bond when you got an illegal building they're gonna loan you $4 million for? Come on, are they that stupid? It's an illegal building. You cannot sit here and trust the fact that by the time your negotiations go on, that zoning board in Woodstock hasn't changed characters. And they could say, oh, we're not gonna do that. And you're stuck with a huge white elephant. This is incorrect. Nobody ever does anything in real estate without things like that written down. Nobody in their right mind would get that property with that illegal zoning and not have a paper that says, we are committed as a zoning board of Woodstock to okay that. And why don't you consider that, put the boat off. If you really think you could get that zoning change, put the boat off. Why aren't you putting the boat off? What's such the big rush about it? I don't wanna even know your lovely you've already told me. You told me Luann wouldn't let you have it if you postponed it. That's what you told me, so I know already. And I don't understand why, and maybe it's just short-sightedness. The people in Woodstock are not remembering the Mangan Plan, which is related to what Cornelia said. It's a very easy way to have our library stay where it is by building a 2-story addition on the rear and then moving everything in there that's library stuff. It's got I-beams, it's got an elevator, it's got, you know, all the stuff you need. Put all the library stuff in there, in that 2-story addition, then renovate the front. And it will be wonderful. And we won't have any need for people to wander down a dangerous road to get to the new place. And people that just can't do it. You know, the oldsters around, they can't wander down 212, it's dangerous. So that's what I have to say, and I really think there are many, 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 too many questions. We should put the vote off.
Put the vote on.
Completely.
Put the vote on.
And one other thing I would just like to mention, please take a look at these flyers if you haven't. There's some factual information. So far since 2013, the Library Board of Trustees has spent over $702,000 on wasted plans, and we have nothing to show for it.